The ground beneath Hawaii's Big Island has been convulsing for 10 months. 34 separate eruption episodes, lava fountains reaching 800 feet, but tourists still flock to witness the spectacle. What they don't realize is that Kilauea isn't just putting on a show, it's slowly poisoning the air they breathe. Since December 23, 2024, Kilauea has shattered every prediction. Scientists expected a typical eruption, maybe lasting days or weeks. Instead, Hawaii got something unprecedented: endless cycles of eruption and pause, each episode releasing massive clouds of sulfur dioxide into island air. And here's what health officials aren't telling you. These weren't ordinary volcanic emissions. Each episode released an estimated 15,000 tons of sulfur dioxide daily, enough to trigger respiratory emergencies across the Big Island. Hawaiian hospitals had never seen anything like it. Emergency rooms flooded with patients struggling to breathe, while tourists kept arriving, completely unaware they were walking into an invisible health crisis that stretched across 4,000 square miles. When researchers analyzed air samples during episode 15, what they found made pulmonologists sound the alarm. Sulfur dioxide levels weren't just elevated, they were reaching concentrations that turn human lungs into acid-burned tissue. Dr. Sarah Chen of the University of Hawaii Medical Center put it bluntly. We're seeing sulfur dioxide attached to mucous membranes in the nose, throat, and respiratory tract, forming sulfuric acid on contact. The tissue swelling and respiratory distress we're documenting hasn't been seen since the 1980s Loma Prieta eruptions. Think of your respiratory system like a delicate filter, explains Dr. Michael Torres, Big Island's chief pulmonologist. Sulfur dioxide doesn't just irritate, it chemically burns. At concentrations we're measuring during these episodes, even healthy adults develop symptoms within hours. For asthmatics, children, and the elderly, exposure can trigger life-threatening bronchospasms in minutes. The numbers tell a devastating story. Episode peaks recorded 2,400 parts per billion of SO2. Normal safe levels are under 75 parts per billion. Hospital admissions increased 340% during eruption episodes. 12,000 residents advised to shelter in place repeatedly. Air quality alerts issued 89 times in 10 months. But here's what health officials discovered next. These repeated exposure cycles were creating a new kind of health threat. Unlike continuous eruptions where people either evacuate or adapt, Kilauea's episodic pattern meant communities experienced waves of toxic air followed by brief periods of recovery, never enough time for lung tissue to fully heal before the next exposure. The pattern became horrifyingly predictable. Episode begins. Within hours, emergency call centers light up with respiratory distress reports. Within days, hospital beds fill, schools close, tourism plummets. Then, the episode ends. Air clears temporarily, communities begin to recover, and just as life returns to normal, another episode begins. According to USGS monitoring data, each episode followed a similar pattern: increased seismic activity beneath Halema-Uma'u crater, deformation of the ground surface, then sudden lava fountaining, often with minimal warning. The December 23rd eruption that began this crisis started with just 15 minutes of elevated seismic activity before lava broke the surface, giving communities virtually no time to prepare for the toxic plumes that followed. The medical data revealed something terrifying about these rapid onset episodes. During the 5th episode in February, when southerly Kona winds pushed gas plumes northward across populated areas of the island, hospital admissions jumped 470% in a single day. Doctors described patients arriving with symptoms mimicking severe chemical burns of the respiratory tract. But these weren't industrial accident victims. They were everyday residents who'd simply been outside during the wind shift. What we're witnessing is unprecedented in modern volcanic medicine, explains Dr. Elena Kapuni, Hawaii's state epidemiologist. These aren't just irritating gases. When SO2 combines with moisture in the lungs, it creates sulfuric acid. Repeated exposure causes cumulative damage. We're seeing inflammation cascades in lung tissue that don't resolve between episodes, creating a new chronic condition we're calling episodic volcanic exposure syndrome. The syndrome presents with chronic cough, decreased lung function, hypersensitivity to irritants, and in severe cases, permanent scarring of lung tissue. Children under 10 show the most alarming patterns, with measurable decreases in lung capacity even weeks after exposure ends. Studies indicate up to 30% of exposed children may face lifelong respiratory complications. History reminds us Kilauea's 1983-2018 eruption created similar health crises, but nothing like this episodic pattern. The Lays events of 2018 hospitalized dozens when lava met ocean, creating hydrochloric acid clouds. But those were isolated incidents. What we're seeing now mirrors the air quality disasters of Iceland's Laki eruption in 1783, an event that killed 20% of Iceland's population and caused respiratory deaths across Europe. Episode 23 changed everything when the eruption column reached unprecedented heights, injecting sulfur dioxide directly into upper atmospheric layers. This allowed the toxic plume to travel farther than previous episodes, affecting air quality across the entire island chain. Monitoring stations on Maui, 120 miles northwest of Kilauea, recorded SO2 levels exceeding 200 parts per billion, nearly 3 times the EPA safety threshold. The economic impact compounded the health crisis. Tourism, Hawaii's economic lifeblood, plummeted by 65% during peak episode months. Hotels stood empty. Tour operators filed for bankruptcy. Agricultural products from the island faced quarantine restrictions from importers concerned about contamination. The total economic impact reached $1.2 billion by August 2025, creating a secondary crisis of unemployment and financial stress. The question became, were these episodes creating a new type of volcanic health hazard, one that cycles on and off, preventing communities from recovering between exposures? This wasn't just a big island problem. Trade winds carried sulfur dioxide plumes to Maui, Oahu, even detected in air samples 200 miles away. And meteorologists warned, during Kona wind events, the entire Hawaiian island chain becomes a gas chamber. Hawaiian authorities struggled to develop appropriate response protocols. Traditional evacuation orders designed for lava threats proved inadequate for invisible gas hazards that could shift with changing winds. During episode 19, officials evacuated communities directly downwind of the crater, only to have winds shift overnight, exposing completely different communities to peak concentrations while evacuees remained in shelters. Public health messaging failed to communicate the insidious nature of the hazard. It's not like a hurricane or tsunami where the danger is obvious, explains Civil Defense Director Marcus Kalanikau. People can't see sulfur dioxide. Many don't realize they're breathing dangerous concentrations until symptoms begin. By then, they've already sustained respiratory damage. What happened during the Kona wind event shocked everyone, even experienced volcanologists. For 3 days during episode 27, unusual atmospheric conditions created a temperature inversion layer that trapped volcanic gases near ground level across the island's western coast. Areas previously considered safe, including resort communities around Kona, suddenly experienced SO2 levels exceeding 9,500 parts per billion. Resort medical clinics, unprepared for respiratory emergencies, quickly became overwhelmed. Tourists, many with pre-existing respiratory conditions, found themselves trapped in a toxic environment with limited medical resources. Emergency airlifts transported the most critical patients to Honolulu, but the incident exposed critical gaps in disaster planning for an island dependent on tourism. USGS scientists worked around the clock to develop better prediction models, but Kilauea defied conventional patterns. This series of episodic eruptions doesn't match any behavior we've documented at Kilauea in the historical record, explains Dr. Thomas Michelson, lead volcanologist monitoring the crisis. The magma system appears to be releasing pressure in distinct pulses rather than continuous activity. Each pause allows pressure to rebuild before the next explosive release. The real health crisis was just beginning when researchers identified a disturbing correlation. Communities with repeated SO2 exposures showed increasing rates of secondary bacterial pneumonia. The toxic gases appeared to compromise respiratory immune defenses, allowing opportunistic infections to take hold. What began as chemical irritation evolved into a complex public health emergency spanning respiratory medicine, infectious disease, and emergency management. Medical researchers documented a new phenomenon they termed cascading respiratory vulnerability. Initial SO2 exposure damaged protective mechanisms in the airways. This damage persisted between episodes, making individuals progressively more susceptible to both subsequent gas exposures and respiratory infections. Each episode created a larger pool of vulnerable individuals, accelerating the public health crisis with every eruption cycle. Hawaii's unique geography compounded the problem. The island's varied elevations and microclimates created complex gas dispersal patterns that proved nearly impossible to predict with existing models. Areas considered safe based on prevailing winds suddenly found themselves inundated with toxic plumes when local topography channeled gases in unexpected directions. Remote communities with limited healthcare access faced disproportionate impacts. In Kau district, where the nearest hospital is over an hour away by ambulance, residents with respiratory emergencies faced critical delays in treatment. Mobile medical units deployed to these areas quickly became overwhelmed during peak episodes, forcing difficult triage decisions. The crisis forced innovation in public health response. Health officials distributed sophisticated personal air quality monitors to high-risk individuals, asthmatics, pregnant women, the elderly, creating a crowdsourced real-time monitoring network that often detected dangerous plumes before official monitoring stations. Smartphone alerts warned residents when SO2 levels spiked in their immediate vicinity, potentially saving hundreds of lives. The technology couldn't solve the underlying problem. Kilauea wasn't stopping. Each episode varied in intensity and duration, but the overall pattern continued month after month. Geological monitoring indicated no signs of the magmatic system depleting or stabilizing. USGS officials reluctantly acknowledged they couldn't predict when or if the episodic eruptions would end. The health system adapted through necessity. Pulmonologists developed specialized treatment protocols for volcanic gas exposure. Telemedicine networks connected remote clinics with specialists in Honolulu. Schools implemented automated air quality monitoring systems that triggered immediate lockdowns when SO2 levels rose, keeping children in filtered air environments during episodes. Beyond immediate health impacts, researchers began documenting concerning long-term effects. Blood samples from repeatedly exposed individuals showed markers of systemic inflammation and oxidative stress, potential precursors to cardiovascular disease and other chronic conditions. Preliminary studies suggested increased rates of autoimmune disorders in heavily affected communities, raising questions about volcanic emissions triggering immune dysregulation. We're essentially conducting an unplanned epidemiological study on an entire island population, notes Dr. Kapuni. The data we're collecting will inform volcanic health research globally, but that's cold comfort to families facing lifelong health consequences. By October 2025, Episode 34 had ended as suddenly as it began. Air quality monitors returned to normal. Hospital admissions dropped. Official volcanic alert levels remain at watch. But the medical community is asking uncomfortable questions. What permanent damage has been done to respiratory systems across Hawaii? And when will Episode 35 begin? Preliminary health surveys paint a troubling picture. An estimated 40% of Big Island residents report new or worsened respiratory symptoms since the episodes began. Pulmonary function tests reveal measurable decreases in lung capacity among heavily exposed populations. Children who experienced multiple high-concentration exposures show patterns of airway remodeling typically seen in chemical inhalation injuries. Evacuation fatigue has set in across affected communities. Many families who diligently evacuated during early episodes now stay put, gambling that each new eruption won't be accompanied by wind patterns that bring gases their way. Others have abandoned homes and businesses altogether, creating ghost neighborhoods in areas repeatedly hit by toxic plumes. We're facing a slow-motion disaster that defies traditional emergency response frameworks, explains FEMA coordinator Jessica Martinez. This isn't a hurricane that strikes once and passes. It's an ongoing, unpredictable hazard that communities simply cannot adapt to long-term. Yet, federal disaster assistance programs aren't designed for open-ended crises. Hawaiian cultural practitioners bring important perspective to the crisis. Native Hawaiian volcano experts note that traditional knowledge describes periods of Pele's breath being dangerous, with cultural practices including specific protocols for protecting communities during these times. Historical chants reference wind patterns that carry dangerous emanations from Kilauea, knowledge now validated by modern air quality monitoring. Environmental impacts extend beyond human health. Agricultural areas repeatedly exposed to high SO2 concentrations show concerning patterns of crop failure and soil acidification. Native plant species exhibit leaf burn and reduced growth in gas-affected zones. Wildlife monitoring indicates altered behavior patterns and decreased reproductive success success among native bird populations in repeatedly exposed habitats. The question isn't just whether Kilauea will erupt again, it's whether 10 months of poisoned air has created a generation of Hawaiians with permanently damaged lungs. And as episode 35 builds pressure beneath Halemaumau crater, thousands of families face an impossible choice: flee their island home or risk their children's health on a volcano that refuses to follow the rules. This crisis raises profound questions about how communities adapt to geological hazards that defy historical patterns. Climate scientists warn that changing atmospheric conditions may influence how volcanic emissions disperse and interact with human populations. What we're witnessing at Kilauea may foreshadow similar challenges at other volcanic systems worldwide. The episodic pattern creates not just physical health impacts, but psychological trauma as well. Communities cycle between acute crisis, uncertain recovery, and anxious anticipation of the next episode. Mental health providers report increased rates of anxiety disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress, particularly among children who experience severe respiratory symptoms. As pressure builds beneath Kilauea once again, scientists, health officials, and communities brace for what comes next. Will episode 35 follow the established pattern, or will the volcanic system evolve into something even more dangerous?